I'll just quickly go in to the presentation. We're located up in Seattle, Washington. Do drop by the office and check us out. We're right by the stadium. Sorry, Seahawks Stadium. So if you're up here for a game, we're right by the stadium. Drop by. You get an idea of why material and making is so important to our firm. We will never have branch offices. We insist that basically anybody that works for us does what an architect does. And what for all of us, there's a tradition of architecture, which is in fact the work from the early scribbles, the conceptual stuff, meeting with the clients, dealing with the program, dealing with the sort of usual drivers of a project, all the way through the technical portions of the projects, the construction documents, and in particular, into the construction administration, which is, of course, so heavily involved in the materials, the stuff we make. I always say that, actually, if you think about it, architects are kind of like, a bunch of my friends are composers, and it took me a while. All of a sudden I realized, you know, in a way, we're sort of like oddly composers of materials. Because, in fact, our instructions, our drawings, we're not actually moving that material, we're not actually assembling that material or fabricating that material, but we're giving instructions to somebody about how, what we imagine where those materials might end up. Ultimately, so in other words, during construction administration, possibly the most important part of the phases of everybody in our office is to actually engage the craftspeople on the site, because they're the ones that actually know the materials better than we. And if there is a good conversation and a good sort of understanding between architect and craftsperson, you are privileged as an architect to learn a lot more about the materials. The days when the architects actually built these places are long gone. There's some changes that are coming up, obviously, with some computer fabrication, digital fabrication. We're 160 people. That's a shock. That's a total shock to Jim and I. I started the firm 30 years ago, and there were 12 people the day I started, and within 5 days there were 7 people, and that was not a particularly good trend as far as I felt. But we've sort of progressively increased in size over the years, and most of the people that started with us are still with us, and that has a lot to do with the ability, because I'm sure there's going to be a question about, well, with 160 people, how do you in fact engage the craft and the fabrication of a lot of your projects? And we can answer that in a little more detail. You know, we're located in Seattle, but where I grew up was in eastern Washington, northern Idaho, southern British Columbia, southern southwest Alberta. That's big country. That's country that you would recognize here in Texas. And when you grow up, I think, and this is what's important for me, when you grow up in a big landscape like this, you realize that your part of that big landscape is actually relatively small. And I think that's actually important as an architect to understand, that the context of the place is a whole lot more important than you are, and that really the information that's out there is information that should drive you as a designer. It's not a particularly sort of narrowly focused, self-focused sort of direction. I hope that makes sense, because there's a problem in architecture, I think, where it is so sort of sort of person-oriented that it becomes sort of almost a caricature of an ego. But in fact, architecture is really, it's not art. It really is basically, I think, a platform for experiencing your surroundings, whether it's a big city or whether it's a big landscape. So I hope that makes sense. And I look back on my years spending time in the landscape that I grew up in with big sky, big land, subtle changes in topography like you see here in Texas, where you sort of understand that the subtlety and the nuance of a place is sometimes, frankly, a lot more important than the sort of Wagnerian sort of center point of something large in front of you. And you learn that it's about the nuance, it's about the subtlety. Quickly, I grew up in northern Idaho, eastern Washington. That was an extraction industry area. Also, it's obviously that's material focused. That's about making little things out of big things as a kid. And interestingly, Ian and I share kind of a fascination with physics and fascination with engineering. Obviously, that has a lot to do with materials, the science of the materials themselves, but also the science of the materials of how to handle those things. Growing up around sawmills, working in sawmills, growing up around mines. The largest silver mine used to be in northern Idaho. Silver mines used to be in northern Idaho. Fascinating for a kid, at least a kid that was interested in it, to sort of see how we sort of use the natural forces to manipulate our environment. Because my parents are both from Switzerland, immigrants from Switzerland. The mountains are terribly important for my background. I probably spent I always say a lost youth, basically, spending more time in the mountains than I did in school, frankly. And I had to catch up a little bit. But I look back on those years as being ultimately really important. Again, understanding the engineering of materials, the engineering of the natural forces, and how these parts and pieces come together, because ultimately, I think that's what architecture really is, the foundation of architecture. Also, I was lucky enough to grow up with some of the best climbers in the world, John Roskelley and Chris Kopczynski, and learn about the discipline of elegance, because climbing a mountain is not about just getting to the top, it's about how you get to the top, how efficiently, how effectively, how safely, obviously, and how you sort of push those envelopes to get into more and more interesting things. I think that's a basis of architecture. You really do have to do your schooling, your homework, and sort of begin to understand what the fundamentals are, just like you do with materials and physics. And then you can basically push those limits a little bit as you're evolving your practice. And I learned that, from John and Chris. I was a classic knucklehead 16-year-old, that just needed some schooling. But I also grew up during the hot rod era. Everybody in our neighborhood had some form of a hot rod in their garage, and I was lucky enough to work on some of those cars. And what I think is interesting about architecture, and you'll notice I have a Jean Tinguely fountain in the upper right-hand corner, and I think Jean Tinguely was saying something with his fountain in Basel, which I think is really important relative to art, was that there really isn't that much difference between what some people would call lowbrow art and highbrow art. And he always engaged and appreciated the artists that were involved in these hot rods. I mean, obviously upper left-hand corner, that's Ed Big Daddy Roth. That's not a particularly attractive car, if you ask me. But Beatnik but it was his vision, it was his idea, and he was a true artist in the sense that he would take a commodity and he would manipulate that commodity in his own sort of vision. And in the lower left-hand corner is, of course, Tommy Ivo, and who maybe it wasn't about the shape of the car, but it was about the machinery of the car. And Tommy didn't necessarily, he had a hell of a sort of a background in mechanics and machinery, but he didn't necessarily have the kind of sophistication that a lot of us now see in the auto industry. And his theory when he built that particular car was if one engine went fast, 4 engines would go really fast. The problem was, and that was intuition on his part. The problem was, of course, every time he started up that car and drove it, he basically burned his head because of the heat that was just basically being generated by the 4 cars in front. Lower right-hand corner, I spent a lot of time in the, as much as I can anyway, in the salt flats of Bonneville, because I get to see these unbelievable creations by people that don't call themselves artists. They would. I don't know if they'd be offended by it, but they don't. They don't think exactly that they're making art. But in fact, they're making unbelievable art. And the craft that goes into these machines, and the sort of intuitive science, and sometimes even studied science, is unbelievable. I mean, this machine will go 500 miles an hour, and it's piston driven. These are incredible forces that they're dealing with. But it's not just about the speed, it's about the beauty of these machines built by people that didn't think they were making something beautiful. So there's something what's kind of wonderful about the craft of something and the beauty of something that just sort of translates what we would say is art or architecture. And I've learned a lot from the people that build those machines. I also learned a lot from artists. Again, lucky as a kid to grow up with Rudy Audio in the upper left-hand corner and his wacky and wonderful terracotta pots. A lower left-hand corner is Ed and Nancy Kienholz. and they're very bizarre art. But my real mentor is the upper right-hand corner, Harold Blaze, who never left Spokane and Coeur d'Alene. He stayed in that small town and continued to make his art. And I would work for Harold and with his sculptures over the years, and learned a lot about not only the heart of an artist, the hard work of an artist, but also what an artist puts into the sculpture when they actually build the piece. So they understand the materials. And he worked in steel, enamel, wood, terracotta, just virtually any materials. And I still consider myself lucky to have actually grown up with Harold and learned about all of those skills in the heart again. And this is Ed and Nancy Keenholz's installation in New York that I just recently saw. They're kind of being rediscovered, even though, they came from the 60s. They were provocateurs. At the bottom line, and this is what I think architects don't do enough of and artists do more of, they go out and they poke basically the culture and kind of wake us up. And Ed and Nancy were clearly, Ed grew up on a farm in Eastern Washington, a wheat farm in Eastern Washington, yet he's in Berlin and Los Angeles, literally poking the culture so deeply that there was actually protests and almost sort of semi-violent responses to some of his work. Real aggressive, real challenging, but I really think that's what we're supposed to do. Supposed to do as artists in particular and architects at some level. This is the shop where I learned how to build sculptures, how to make things, how to move materials, and actually how to sort of think about how to take the physics that I had been fascinated as a kid and ultimately started to study and use it in a purposeful way, just with basically the body being part of that. It was also climbing is also part of that. Mountain climbing is also part of that, where you're just using your body with the physics of the things you're using to manipulate the materials in front of you into some sort of meaningful shape. So the last slide here is a particularly important piece of architecture that I grew up around, and it was done by a guy named Royal McClure. No one knows who Royal is anymore, but when I was, in 300 square feet in 1961, when he built this cabin, I think he does more architecture than, frankly, I have yet to do after many, many years of basically doing small projects to large projects. And that ultimately, I think, is what I think architecture for me is about, is not the big projects. In fact, I think, even though I work occasionally on big projects, I think the small projects, the sort of granular effect you can have culturally is super important. That's one reason art is so important, not just in big cities like Dallas, but out into the small communities. So you really engage the larger community, and I think that's true with architecture too. The smaller the buildings, the more the more flexible they are, and the more rapid they are out into the culture. In Royal's cabin, I still hold as possibly one of the most important little pieces of architecture in my career. So that's it. We're going to roll a bunch of projects in a loop. Ian's going to pepper me with some questions. So thank you. I hope that made sense. And hopefully, as you see the images come up on the screen, you're going to see influence from what I think is influence from my childhood on the loop.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for spending your Sunday afternoon with us. So we're here to talk about materials, but the idea of operability, of giving people control over the building, is one feature of your work that I think a lot of people are interested in. And I think there's been an evolution in thought on that. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so, and that's actually a really interesting, that question gets asked a bit. If you look at my career, I lucked out because at some point somebody said something on a project, and I sort of repurposed some of my experiences in the extraction industry and my climbing background and my physics background, where I knew that we could do something that most people might not want to do in a small cabin, chicken point cabin. Hopefully we'll see that here in a little bit. But I've always been interested in the morphability and the operability of a building. My dad's an architect, was an architect, and I grew up in a mid-century sort of situation. And I remember as a kid thinking, the thing that drove me crazy about the architecture of mid-century houses is that there was a promise that there was an inside-outside relationship, that you could just feel the landscape coming into the inside and the inside going out to the outside. But it was not held true because you couldn't open those big sheets of glass. And what you felt like you were in a terrarium or something. And either you were looking at the animals inside the terrarium or the animals outside of the terrarium. And so there was and I actually didn't want to be an architect. That's a whole different story, but because my dad was an architect. That had a lot to, the old classic father-son thing. But I actually didn't like what architects were doing at that point with their buildings. And as I got older, I found myself back into architecture. And one of my agendas with architecture is, in fact, not only the materiality of the places, that the steel feels like steel, wood feels like wood, concrete looks and feels like concrete, but also that those things were allowed to sort of naturally flow inside and outside, literally naturally flow inside to outside. So you could change your environment or change your relationship to your environment. So over time, I started to develop these things called gizmos, which are basically just little simple mechanical devices of some kind that you can actually lift or change or shape very heavy things quite easily. And there's one, hopefully there's a video that'll come up in a bit. It's a little 4.5-year-old little girl that's basically lifting 6.5 tons of glass and steel, and she's got a broken foot, So, and it's just, it's kind of like a wake-up call to all of us that, we always want to push buttons or move machines or touch a lever to move something. But in fact, our ancestors never were able to do that. And for me, it's just a fascinating sort of effort or exercise to see how much more we can engage ourselves naturally in sort of the movement of our environment. I hope that makes sense. And it doesn't always work. Sometimes the stuff is too heavy. Sometimes it's too cumbersome. So then you rely on electricity or you rely on hydraulics.
So in many of your projects, you've talked about wanting to express a certain ruggedness in the exterior, but then a softness and a familiarity in the interior. Could you talk about that and how that leads to certain material choices, for example?
So that's a really good question, because I always say to clients, if sometimes the buildings look a little rough or a little industrial, a little aggressive, but I'm hoping that when you go inside these buildings, you realize it's kind of like a Tootsie Pop. It's hard on the outside, soft on the inside. And that's what you can do with materials, and that's the wonderful, nature of materials, is that you can find the types of materials that we're familiar with and feel really soft to the touch and almost massage your feet if you walk across. And on the outside materials, if you're smart about it, you can let those materials age naturally. And I think it's almost like aging in general is sort of, I think, kind of interesting. Even aging people, even seeing yourself age is just kind of like fascinating to watch, actually maybe more interesting than stopping time. So there are these, as you know, Ian, there's architecture out there that almost stops in time. They want it to stop and be perfect the day it opens. It's white, it's perfect, it's crisp, it's clean, and it's not recognizing that, in fact, we're in a natural, very aggressive in some cases, natural landscape, and it's going to move that perfection and slowly destroy that perfection. I want to embrace that movement and that changing nature of materials, and hopefully they sort of mature with time and become more interesting with time. And I hope that makes sense to you all. I want the buildings to move and change, and I want them to actually literally change over time and hopefully become more interesting.
So there's a quote from Mohsen Mostafavi where he says that finishing ends the construction, but weathering constructs finishes. I wonder, it's a little bit of what you've talked about just now.
I love that. I've never heard that one, and I love that quote, because I think it's absolutely true. You're not going to change Mother Nature from changing your building, especially on the outside and even on the inside, as people use things and sort of shape things by just their daily use, or it's just it's what it's all about. These are projects, we're all building things. Every one of us is building things are making things that are going to be around for 100 years, probably 200 years. Somebody once asked me, if you had a few wishes, what would your wishes be? And I said, God, I would just like to trade one day now for one day 200 years from now, and just see what happened, culturally, and what happened materially with all these projects. Because who knows? Actually, as we all know, some of the ruins that we see around the world are probably more interesting than when they were actually finished, intact buildings.
No. So going back to, I guess we can say, the arts and craft movement of 100 years ago, some people have said that it was a reaction to the industrialized world and how the craftsman was taken out, but you've talked about retaining the marks of the craftsperson in your projects, in certain parts of the project. Could you talk about that?
Oh boy, and that, of course, that's raising big issues here, and you may see a Hawaii project come up with a big long pool, and when you see that, it very much touches on this issue. For the most part, a lot of the early work is hand done, is handmade, and I totally agree. And that was like me working with Harold. His hands were shaping the sculpture, and he wasn't using CATIA. He wasn't digitizing a maquette and then enlarging it. He was actually using his head, on how to make these parts and pieces. And by hand, he would shape these things, and he would call them anomalies, which is kind of a nice way of saying he would discover things about what the material was doing and make these sort of minute changes as he was making the sculpture. And his feeling was that it was actually adding value to the piece, and I totally agree. So if you're working with craftspeople on a site, and they've come in with their own DNA, their own sort of biases, if you're there enough on the site, you're going to actually be able to engage that craftsperson, and they'll probably add value to the project. And you can feel it when you go into these projects, where you can feel the hand of a craftsperson, because it's not perfect, but it's sort of wonderfully shaped or wonderfully moved in a way that you can't do with a machine. A machine is going to be perfect, right? So the issue is digital fabrication. Obviously, I did some of these things by myself, just bending it with the metal. That's just, just from my background, knowing how to do it. And it has, I'm not a craftsperson, that's for sure, but it has a feel like somebody made this stuff. But digital fabrication is actually really interesting, because the project in Hawaii, and I'll note it, virtually all of the wood, it's just unbelievable. We were able to do these unbelievable joints, almost more Japanese joinery joints, because in the digital fabrication world, the machine doesn't matter how complex it is, really, and cuts it in a way that just fits together like a glove. But if you were doing that in real time with real labor, it would be unbelievably expensive to make that stuff, and virtually impossible. So you'd use splice plates and angles, steel angles and bolts. Well, it's not being done by a craftsperson, and it's perfect. And so the question, it's just a question, I'm not trying to make a judgment on it, it's just a question, at what point is that really craft at that point? It's not hand-done craft, but is it craft? Somebody up in British Columbia worked the machines, worked the computer, digital output, made the thing work, but it was all done by machine.
You've talked about authenticity versus slickness, and I think this kind of flows into that question.
Yeah, if I'm following the question, as an example, our office, this is the office again, you just saw some parts and pieces. The hand of a craftsperson, and we don't die grind our welds. We don't over polish materials. We leave mild steel as mild steel. Where we cut it, you can see where it was cut. You can see the bands where the machine kind of cut the steel, and that's intentional. That gives it that sort of minute detail, that sort of soulful detail that I think is really important. And how you curate that. You know, at what point does that become too much or too little? I don't know. You know, it's a balance, but it definitely takes it out of that sort of over-polished, over-perfect, shiny architecture that we're trying to avoid. Or if it's shiny, yin and yang it with something that maybe, oh, here we go. This is the Chicken Point cabin with this window. So this window is about 6.5 tons of glass and steel. And that's Phil Turner, who now works for us. He's just a genius, an engineering genius. And this is Savannah. She's 4.5 years old. She's got a broken foot, and she's lifting 6.5 tons of glass and steel. She doesn't, no machine, no, you know, with a broken foot. Yeah, she's handicapped. So that was her job. Every time they came to the cabin, she would open the window. So those are those sort of wonderful moments. And again, I'm off subject on answering the question about, you know, handmade, and this is all handmade, even though it looks kind of shiny. But this is a good point where you can do something really precise next to something like concrete block. And I hope there's a yin and yang sort of conversation between the materials. Does that kind of answer your question?
I think so.
Because you really, there's nothing wrong with perfection and, you know, like the hand of God kind of perfection. But if it's all perfection, it kind of goes soulless. If you do it next to something that maybe is quote unquote less perfect, I think it.
I think there's also, and part of the question, maybe you don't agree, is that we live in a modern world where we're so disconnected from how things get to our table, for example. Yeah. And I think you've made it an effort to connect what gets built and how it got built, and there's a person behind it. Yeah,
that's not really an agenda of mine. You know, that's not the agenda is. I just find it completely fascinating when people make things, or how they make things, or do things, or invent things. And
so last night we were talking a little bit about Álvaro Siza, the Portuguese architect, and he has talked about having to work with a limited choice of materials by necessity because of where he was. Mm-hmm. But what he pointed out is that led to a certain mastery over those materials. And I'm going to ask the question, I guess, is it fair to say that you've made a conscious effort to limit your core palette of materials?
Ooh, not really. No, that's terrific discipline. I think, yeah, we live in North America. We have everything at our feet, basically. I will say I do try to make decisions based on the materials that are available and part of that area. But definitely, if I'm working in Texas, I'm going to be really interested in the stones and the, you know, and the sort of aggregate that Texas has underlying it, and the wood products. But steel, of course, steel is a commodity product that you know, you can get it anywhere. But I think it's I mean, at some point, the question is actually kind of interesting and maybe somewhat academic, because at this point, our world is becoming, I mean, I always would say it's becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, it is really small. And we do work now around the globe, and the physics of the world are the same, whether you're in Rio de Janeiro or Australia or in Seattle, Washington, or Dallas, Texas. There are the nuances between those places that I think are most interesting.
So speaking about the use of new materials, I'm thinking of the Tacoma Art Museum, where you were using these panels that are made from recycled paper.
Yeah.
And that seems like a fairly innovative use of a material. Could you tell us a little bit about how you arrived at that solution? Or?
Kind of failed.
Oh, did it?
So, yeah, that was an uncomfortable question, but it was perfect.
So, Mr. Kundig.
Yeah. Well, so and I'm glad the question was asked, because this is a company that made laptops after World War II, when stone was in scarce supply. So the labs, they had a lot of, there was obviously in the 50s, there was a lot of labs being built. So this is a company in Tacoma, Washington that made basically laptops, black laptops out of resin and wood products. So, you know, these are tops that have to be, I mean, they're burnt, they're scorched, they pour acid on them. They're really abused. This should keep rolling. I don't know why it stopped, but sorry about that. So what they said, the company said, well, we can use this as a building material. And it is on the Tacoma Art Museum, we're having some issues. We're having some issues with how it's weathering in that. And here's a case where the weathering is not so great, you know? And so that's always this interesting journey is, well, when does the weathering not really, when is it not good? And how do you make those decisions?
So let's talk about that, because I think using new materials sometimes, or on purpose choosing certain materials that could cause problems down the road, that involves a certain amount of risk. But I'm thinking of the house at Pierre. So when does it become worth it to take those risks, and how do you navigate that?
Risk is a big deal, yeah. Sorry the loop stopped.
It's a beautiful image. So.
Yeah, at least. So this is a risk. This project was a risk. This was a bureaucratic risk that we took. And I think that goes back to, you know, what I was trying to say, just learning from the artists that I grew up with, is that really your job is to look at the commodity, or the hot rodders, look at the commodity of the situation and try to reinvent is an overstatement, but how do you sort of modify it in a way that it personalizes it or makes it more interesting? So, but that's risk. I mean, like, you know, doing a window wall of 6.5 tons of glass and steel, and the direction from the owner was they wanted their, I'm sorry, for some reason, this is just re-looping back to the beginning of the loop. I wonder if we're just missing a part of the loop. I mean, that's a big risk. Now people are doing that, but somebody had to go out there and do, and actually embrace that risk. Well, that was us. That was Phil Turner, the engineer, and it was also in particular the client, because it hadn't been done before. And clients that hire us that are able to understand, and clients are big risk takers if you think about it, because they're basically going out and hiring some Yahoo architect to spend a bunch of fee and then ultimately a bunch of construction money on a thing you don't even know. It's like commissioning art. You know, how many of us commission art? That's a scary thing. Well, architecture is very similar. You're commissioning something and you don't even know what you're ending up with. So clients that hire architects are risk takers. And then some of our clients are willing to sort of indulge us or take risks on some of these material choices or physical device choices. And then hopefully it always works out. And so far it has, you know, except some of these material choices that are a little bit more problematic. But the engineering choices, of course, they can be abused, they can be misused, and that's scary. That's scary for all of us.
So other than the material in the Tacoma Museum, are there materials that you will not use?
Let's see. No, I don't think so. I think I'm kind of, any material that comes, I'm trying to think if there's a material I wouldn't use, and one has not really come to mind. If you go into plastics or resins or, you know, sort of quote unquote man-made products, you know, they might be kind of interesting, done in the right way and sort of reconsidered how to use them. I'm just trying to think if there's a material that I don't recall ever trying to work with them. Here's what I don't want to try to do. I don't want to work with a material that's trying to look like another material, if that makes sense. That's probably the most important. If it's plastic, I want it to be plastic. I don't want the plastic to look like wood. Or it could look like wood, but it's got to be like crazy wood. Or, I mean, it's got to look kind of like it's a mistake, comical or something. You want it to look like the material you're using.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back a little bit. I mean, we talked about the ruggedness of the exterior and the softness of the interior. You've spoken about your ideas about prospect and refuge, also about connecting the personal to the universal and back to the personal. You know, these ideas of going outward and coming back in. And I guess we're really interested in hearing about how that applies and translates to material choices, textures, patinas, et cetera.
Yeah, it's almost like the answer is a collection of a bunch of answers. It's like you just want to make material choices that are appropriate to the situation and make those choices because architecture is about context. There's cultural context, but there's also environmental context. So cultural context is, well, the city, what's the impact of the city, what's important. As you all know, our culture is changing. And it's probably changing. This may come as a surprise to some people that I think people are becoming more interested. I'm getting more questions about how to downsize their projects rather than upsize their projects. And it also indicates that people want to feel more, especially in the residential models, but even the hotels we're doing, the resorts we're doing, there's a sense that people want to feel like they're in that outside world, but they're sort of protected and cozy and intimate in that outside world. So overscaled bedrooms and living rooms and entry foyers that's being reconsidered culturally. And so you respond to those cultural influences with material choices that I think are appropriate to recognize. I think architecture basically should be voyeurs of culture and of the environment and learn from that context and then begin to assemble an appropriate response to what the clients are saying, regardless if it's a large institutional building or a small cabin in some big wild landscape.
So the majority of your projects, or a lot of them, have been residential, and I think you've spoken about the importance of residential to teaching you as a designer to design at the scale of the human body. Yeah. And I think that's just an interesting way of learning about how you should learn about design.
Absolutely.
And you always take it for granted that in architecture school you design a house, yep. And you always wonder why. So could you expand about that, the focus, what you learn at that scale, and how you can translate that to the larger scale projects?
Well, I actually think the reason houses are so important, it's not, and I always say that, three things: food, water, shelter. Shelter is the basis of protecting us, it's a baseline need people have beyond clothing. You need shelter and we've needed shelter since day one of our species. So that's one reason I think everybody would like in their dreams to build their own house or to buy their own house or to live in their own house. And even if it's an apartment, it is their cocoon in a way. It's their womb in a way. And what that means is that genetically we're wired for that sort of need and that scale of how we associate with people, how we move through space, when we feel comfortable and when we don't feel comfortable. And architecture, unfortunately, now has sort of turned its back on residential work as unimportant, when in fact it's, I think, the driver of large projects. When I work on hopefully, the large projects that you visit that I've worked on, you're going to get a sense that there is a group of people that understand what it is to be human and what it means. What's the flow, what's the sort of inherent sort of quality of that space that makes it feel like a human space. I go into a lot of world-class, award-winning large architecture, and it leaves me like cold and kind of remote to the situation. And I think that's too bad, frankly. Some of like Caesar is a perfect example. Mm-hmm. His buildings are unbelievably powerful at the larger scale. It's because he knows the small scale. Some of the Zoom tour, his large buildings are unbelievably wonderful at the small scale, even when he does a large building. Corbusier was certainly like that because he was able to do small buildings and understand how to translate that to larger buildings. So it's unfortunate, I think, just circling back, that schools have sort of turned their back on the scale of the residential scale, the scale of living, basically.
One gets the sense that you don't want your buildings to be too precious, Do you understand what I mean by that? I think that they're always accessible, that they're not better than the people that are inside those spaces.
Yeah. Well, you got to feel comfortable. You got to feel like, well, here's an interesting thing. If you do a custom house, and there's actually something that becomes a little more difficult when you're doing something more like for like a resort or a hotel, because you're doing it for this anonymous person out there, so you sort of imagine that. But if you're doing a custom home for somebody, you know, in a weird way, what you're doing is, in a very special way, actually, you're being invited by somebody to get to know them quite personally, and you're sort of doing a very important self-portrait of the family. So you're actually trying to understand what's important to this family, how does this, what's the legacy of this family, and, you know, self-portraits, the really good self-portraits are the ones that it looks like the person, but then all of a sudden you realize it is the person because the artist has somehow picked up something, whatever it is, an inflection or a position or whatever, that says a lot about that person. Well, in a way, a custom home is very much a self-portrait of the family.
So going back to the topic of materials and the idea of the human scale, talk to us about the design of the Tom Kundig collection, these series of elements which are at the human scale, at the tactile scale.
Well, so here's a case where a craftsman, 12th Avenue Iron, came to me and said, look, we've been doing all this steel stuff for you. Would you be interested in doing more of a commodity hardware line that was really based on a lot of the things that are important to you? And I said, boy, that's a nice invitation. And so we've been doing these, you know, again, if you're really following your sort of preaching, you know, we're always saying that the nanoscale is as important as the max scale. So these are the parts of the building that you touch. These are the parts of the buildings that you move. That's the most intimate connection you have with a building. And to be involved in that part of the building is a huge honor. I forgot. What was the book? I'm having it a mental. I'll try to remember his name. He's a terrific author, but he refers to where you touch the building. That's the handshake with the building, which is Palasma, Johanni Palasma, and it's, you know, that's a wonderful way of describing what Ian is asking is this is that human touch. This is that connection. This is that human connection that we have with buildings are the parts that you touch. So if you do accessories, you do door handles, you do these things that people manipulate at a small scale, it's a very special place to be, rather than doing something big and grand.
So you use a lot of, I'm going to say, materials that have a story, recycled, repurposed materials in some of your projects. One of the pieces there came from a Harley Davidson that was in Phil's. So I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that type of cannibalism, or what you think those projects bring to the project. They seem to bring their own backstory.
Yeah, they always do, because you never know where you're going to. In fact, there's off a Ford tractor, there's a governor that was pulled off that controls that device, or that the device is controlling that big 6.5 tons of glass and steel, because it's one thing to lift something up, and it's another thing to drop it in a controlled way. So that governor actually slows down that big window when it drops back into place. And it's fantastic. It was Phil came up with it. He had a Ford tractor in his farm up north, and he salvaged it, or he took it off the tractor. I hope the tractor still works. I'm not even sure, but he donated it to the project. And yeah, some of those discoveries as you're working, if you're really smart about it, and again, this goes back, you know, like Brad will talk about his work. He has to be there to make it. And that's kind of true with a lot of these projects. The projects are sort of the result of a storyline that everybody existed. And so when you're working on a project, you're out there experiencing something, and it's in the back of your mind, and you see something, you grab it, and then you bring it to this project. So these repurposed, sort of discovered parts and pieces have a lot to do with you just being out there and being curious about what's around you, so that then you can hopefully include those parts and pieces that you discover in the project.
So let's talk a little bit about your practice in your studio. You said 160 people, so a large office. You are a global practice. You do work all over the world. So how involved are you in every project, and how do you manage being so large?
It's a really good question, and it becomes more and more difficult, and as you grow. But what has sort of helped us not lose that connection to the work is that I work with. It's just an unbelievable group of people, and a lot of these people I've been working together with for 20 years. And so and Jim and I have been working together for 30 years. Kirsten, who's now leading the firm as a CEO, she and I have been working together for 24 years, and Alan and I have been working together for 18. So that's the ownership. Kevin, who now just became recently the 5th owner, he's been working with us probably about 18 years, the same thing. And then with the principals and the associates, 12, 15 years. There's just a seamless kind of understanding and a dedication. We were talking earlier about the people that come to our firm I always say, and I don't know if people actually appreciate this in the office, but I always describe our office as 160 misfits and weirdos, because these are people that wouldn't fit into a corporate structure of any kind. So if you visit us and visit the office, I think you'll see that even at 160 people, it's a studio, and it's an effective studio. It's not a mess. It's just like people work hard, they're efficient. And that's the only way it could work.
So I heard somebody say to me once that you don't really figure out architecture until you've been practicing and you're in your 50s. Now, there's some notable exceptions to that, but I wonder what you think about that, and what you think the future holds for your practice.
The 2 questions are really good ones. And sorry about the loop again. There's supposed to be I've been working the last 10 years, believe me, and there was a bunch of stuff that was there, but check our website out. I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Yeah, if you don't really figure architecture out until you're kind of in your 50s, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that is true. Everybody knows the 10,000 hour sort of idea that you have to do something for 10,000 hours before you become really good at it, and I absolutely agree. When I started working, again, I grew up in architecture. I was around artists. I was around architects. I went to school. There was nothing about the profession of architecture that I wasn't skeptical about and didn't know sort of the downside, dark side of architecture. So I wasn't naive to it, but I wasn't skilled at it. And I became an architect right after graduate school. I passed the exam. But there's no way I was an architect. There was no way that I was really capable at what an architect should be, because, I'll just share a little story. This old guy walks by when I was drawing. This is back in the days of pen and ink, and he said, "You're not an architect until when you're drawing a line in plan that you don't understand that line in volume, in the third dimension, and volumetrically and technically." And what that line means as a sort of a larger picture. And of course, I thought that was, I didn't buy it. I just thought it was sort of BS. And but all of a sudden, you probably saw that moment also, when all of a sudden, and after about 10,000 hours, oddly, all of a sudden that line, or however you put that line down, you have a picture in your mind of what all the issues are. So young people that come to work for the firm, they have to understand that we're actually looking at the plan that we all may be working at, but we're working at another level, and they'll make it. They're smarter than I am. They're going to hit it. It's just that they're not there yet, and they're always kind of amazed that you understand, at a higher level. People have said it's an old person's profession. I do believe it's true. I didn't start hitting my stride until I was about 48, and now it's feeling like, that was a point in time where I felt like I was a mature architect. I was actually doing stuff that was not only understanding the basics of architecture, but also understanding how to push architecture. So it takes a while. There was a second part to your question.
What does the future hold? By the way, your answer makes me feel really hopeful.
The future of architecture. God, I think it's, I don't know if people noticed that it may have been following the firm. We took the word architects off of our name. Now we call ourselves Olson-Kundig. That was pretty controversial. My wife thinks it's ridiculous. You guys are architects. You should be proud of being an architect. And we took it off because the firm is evolving a little bit. We always have had an interior design focus, but now we have a sort of a larger interior design group. We're doing accessories, we're doing furniture. We're also doing, Alan is out there doing unbelievable visitor experience things in museums and in foundations. So there's an evolution of the firm that we just felt, rightly or wrongly, wasn't always under the term, under the heading of architects. So I think that's where architecture is going. If you listen to Steve Jobs talk about, he was the first one to talk about the architecture of technology and the architecture of the devices, because he felt that the architects were the people that sort of could bring the poetic and the rational together, right? That's what architecture is the intersection of the poetic and rational. He didn't like working with engineers. He liked working with architects because they're able to bring those two pieces together. And so there's this interesting sort of, people are calling it architecture, but we wouldn't say it's architecture. But they see architects as being this really interesting sort of thinking group out there, to the point now, one of my clients is this well-known guy in the technology industry, a guy named Nicholas Negroponte, and he said that MIT Media Lab now is thinking that the future of education is not to train a bunch of architects, but is to train people to think like architects.
Interesting.
Which is kind of exciting in some ways, because theoretically, if architects have been trained well, they're collaborators, they're critical thinkers, and they're makers, and they're smart about how to efficiently sort of get that out into the culture. And proof's in the pudding. We'll see what happens in the future. But that I think is I don't think it's going to be doing residential work or buildings. I do think the building industry is going to go through massive changes in the next 2 or 3 generations. I think you're going to see a lot more repurposing of older buildings. I'm excited about that, frankly, going into older buildings and reimagining them as the bones of something that's even better than what's going on. And there were a bunch of projects that you didn't see of engaging tilt warehouses in really bad neighborhoods and turning them into art galleries with Kiefers, at that kind of stuff. I just am so excited about that stuff, or wineries or breweries. And, these are discard buildings that people think are not interesting. They have to be torn down. They're not pretty brick buildings or old warehouse buildings. They are kind of like the typical strip mall warehouse that you wouldn't necessarily look twice at, but I just love that. The idea that 80% of the buildings out there, the Nasher is beautiful. That's pretty fantastic. But 80% of the buildings are not. And how do you engage that existing fabric and make something beautiful out of something that maybe other people would want to throw away or discard? That, I think, is the future.
That's perfect. Well, thank you, Tom. I think this has been a great insight.
Thank you.
Into your work and your way of thinking about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.